is a podcast produced in collaboration with Democracy at Work and the Zero Hour. Here we explore history, science, and culture to imagine what a better and post-capitalist world might look like, and furthermore, how we might get there. This podcast is founded on the belief that our technological imaginations have far outraced our social imaginations, leaving us at the mercy of the exploitative few. This week's episode of All for All will talk about how to talk with other working people about politics. Notice I said other working people because one of the big problems I have with discussions and debates on the left, broadly speaking, not the socialist left or the economic left necessarily, but overall, including the centrist left and so on, is working people are talked about as if they were an alien species that somehow co-populated the earth with us. And of course, most of us, even those of us who may have something approaching professional status, are economically speaking workers, something we can go into in further depth at some other point. But the fact is, we should be thinking about not how to speak to some vague abstraction called the working people that in too many minds are associated with a certain cultural stereotype, and thinking instead about how to speak to the people we live with, we do our jobs with, we commute with, and so on, and how to listen, how to have conversations, which is something that can't be poll tested. It has to be soul tested, for lack of a better term. And one of my inspirations prompts for coming up with it is a good excellent labor reporter who writes for Jacobin, among other places, tweeted out on X, quote, an excellent recent study of working people's political views showed that only 14% of workers are consistently left-wing on both economic and social issues, and that only 16% are, quote unquote, tuned out persuadables, which I suppose means people you can convince. First of all, I want to say something about this notion of left wing as a descriptor of both social and economic issues. There was a time when those two issues were largely inseparable, that when you talked about fighting for the rights of workers, better wages, better working conditions, that kind of thing, it was inseparable from the struggle for social rights, for social justice. And it's only in recent years that there's been cleaving taking place between those two issues where somehow they're not seen as inseparable. And to me, that's caused by a lot of things, including on the right, the rise of social conservatism as a way to sell religious conservatism and so on, as a way to sell, whether it was abortion or something else, a set of policies that were terrible for working people by distracting them from the economic implications of it. But I think the broader left, meaning in this case, the electoral left, the Democratic Party, is equally guilty because I think they've presented a version of social issues that has been whitewashed of all its economic dimensions. Now, that's very comfortable for the big donors who might be backing the party and most of its candidates, but it means that it makes it all that much easier for the right to peel away working people on these social issues. And that's something I think we need to explore and maybe ask some tough questions about. My friend, and I'm just not naming him because I don't want to diss him, he's a good guy, but my friend tweeted out a poll that said that here's why he was saying only 14% are consistently left-wing on both economic and social issues, because while they ask questions about, government should support Should government support declining industries? Do they favor import limits to protect jobs, etc.? Should we increase the federal minimum wage? By the way, 75% approval, low confidence for big business, and so on. You had healthy pluralities or majorities in a lot of issues. For 62% or nearly two-thirds of working people want to increase the minimum wage, and so on. But then when you get into the questions of whether it's LGBTQ or trans issues or what have you, you start to lose a number of working voters, and I want to talk about how we have conversations about that, but I also want to talk about how we don't have conversations about that. For example, Hakeem Jeffries, who until recently refused to endorse mayoral candidate of his own party, Zohran Mamdani, he finally did, but when he was trying to fight the new socialist left in New York City, he referred to those candidates and the people who backed them as, and I quote, team gentrification, meaning, in other words, that these democratic socialists were the new well-off, latte sipping, professional managerial class, and not real working people. But first of all, as was pointed out in the Nation, among other places, exit polls showed something very different. In the primary, they showed that Mamdani attracted support from a wide range of voters because his campaign was relentlessly focused on working class economic issues, cost of living issues. That is a formula and a message that can work. And trying to paint these voters as if somehow they're the elite is the last gasp, I would hope, of a dying Democratic Party, billionaire-funded cadre. Now, of course, after Trump was elected in 2024, they blamed voters. A lot of them said, well, the voters are to blame for this. My reaction to that, I could quote a lot of lines about that, was voters. Why blame them? We lock them in damp basements. We feed them nothing but shit, and then act surprised if they behave like mushrooms when they go into the polling booth. How about blaming the people who could have told them the truth and didn't in our two-party system? The ones who wouldn't listen when they told pollsters and others that they were suffering economically, and instead responded by telling them their suffering was real. Haven't you looked at the top-line economic numbers? But that is symptomatic of how not to communicate with working people, frankly, because it's a party that's largely out of touch with working people. I'll just give you a few reminders of that. Down in Brazil, a top veteran strategist said, quote, the outcome, he was referring to the election outcome, quote, said more about America than it did about Kamala Harris, their candidate, which is the political consultant's equivalent of saying, hey, shit happens. A Democratic strategist should be able to do more than just throw their hands up in the air and say, oh, we couldn't have done anything better. Another Democratic supporter tweeted, Kamala Harris was not a flawed candidate. America is a flawed country. Well, of course it's flawed. Everybody is flawed. We're all flawed. And this is as if to say that Kamala Harris wasn't flawed. The Democratic Party wasn't flawed. They were perfect. I mean, look, I wish that commentator success, but nobody's perfect. Another mainstream columnist tweeted, this election was not an indictment of Kamala Harris. It was an indictment of America. Well, one thing we know from the election of Donald Trump is indictments don't matter much anymore. Another very liberal sort of darling of the soft fluffy, new agey left, wrote that about the election, and this is relevant to what I have to say about talking to our fellow workers. She blamed the outcome on, quote, the crisis of masculinity, the failure of the mainstream news media, and the rise of the Silicon Valley, end quote. All undeniably bad, but she absolutely hand waved away the financial struggles of working people. She said, quote, speaking of her fellow Democrats, we knew what the problems were and we wanted to fix them. Well, apparently not, because elsewhere she writes that voters, and this is Rebecca Solnit I'm speaking about, elsewhere the voters are accused of worrying needlessly about, quote, an economy when it is thriving. It is hardly thriving. We don't have time to go into the details now, but we know it was not thriving. And in fact, many people were struggling to get by in 2024 as they are now. But in that corner of this sort of paradigm schism, the fight to put food on your table or pay this month's rent was reduced to, quote, being concerned that a trans girl might play on a softball team. Now, that to me is an insult to the working people of America. And I do want to talk about how we communicate with people who may view some of these issues differently than we do. But going back to Donna Brazil, she said there was nothing we could do. She said there was no point, quote unquote, resisting because, quote, the American people rejected rejected normalcy, decency, morality, and chose Trump, end quote. And she concluded, let's sit with that. Well, meanwhile, people were struggling to stay afloat. An opium epidemic, while slowing down somewhat, killed tens of thousands of Americans. We were still reeling from the loss of more than 1 million Americans from COVID, and her own party showed that what played a huge role in it, including in terms of Gaza. Polling from February of that year showed that 2/3 of likely voters, including 77% of Democrats and 69% of independents, wanted to have the U.S. call for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. But that was never on the table. Neither was real relief for working people. Let's sit with that. So we don't have to believe, and the left overall should not believe, that there's a permanent shift to the right on the part of the electorate. That doesn't show in the popular vote, and it doesn't show in the polling. Nor, of course, should we be driven by polling. Everybody, I think, of common sense understands that, but Democratic Party operatives rely almost solely on polling, and I think that's a huge mistake. We'll get to it, but political commentary is also a big part of the problem. The labor reporter who quoted left wing, used the terms left wing and right wing. At least he didn't conflate those with Democratic and Republican, as so many commentators do. But I want to offer a more accurate, to me, political description, which is pro versus anti-worker. Now, that's not to say we diminish social justice issues, identity issues, race, gender, and sexual orientation, and so on. Far from it. But these are inseparable from the problems of working people, because the vast majority of people of every race, every gender, every sexual orientation are working people. So their rights are our rights. But let's start with the economic issues. As we look at those, the working class, if you want to use that term, I do, in this country, is overwhelmingly, quote unquote, progressive. I'm not crazy about the word progressive either, but that's probably a conversation for another time. Another poll by Data for Progress from mid 2024, so relevant to last year's election, expanding Medicare to cover dental, vision, and hearing, 84% support. Cut the costs of prescription drugs in half by making sure Americans pay no more than people pay in Europe or Canada, 84%. Make the wealthy and large corporations pay their fair share of taxes, 82%. Expanding Social Security benefits by making the wealthy pay more, 77%. Cap on rent increases, part of Zohran Mamdani's platform, 75%. Reestablishing the child tax credit, which helps so many families and expired in 2022, 71%. Build at least 2 million units of affordable housing, 70%. That's right, 70%. Minimum wage is $17 an hour, 70%. Go on and on. Cap the amount of money families spend on childcare, 65%. Eliminate medical debt, 64%. Establish Medicare for all, 63%, two-thirds of the electorate almost. Make public colleges and universities tuition free, 59%. Passing the PRO Act that makes it easier for Americans to join unions, 57%. We've got voters in this country, we, the pro-worker left. What we don't have is a party or a rhetorical framework or organization that helps us communicate with them across this unbreachable divide. And one of the ways, as I mentioned earlier, that the divide has been sketched out, going back to the issue of marriage equality and, that great liberal Bill Clinton suggested in 2004 that John Kerry embrace the right-wing Defense of Marriage Act, which would have forbidden states from enacting their own marriage equality laws, to embrace and cut off this issue, this culture war issue. But let's have the uncomfortable conversations with our fellow workers who might disagree with us on that issue. Let's start with LGBTQ. It's true, the working class has not always been as progressive as the middle and upper classes on LGBTQ issues, and that's still true today. But there's progress being made. Support for legislation that protects gay and lesbian individuals, working class people. Now, over 70% of them have a progressive position on that issue. That is a major shift that's happened largely generationally, but in other ways as well. Much as the same way we saw that the support for racial justice shifted in the late 20th century. There was a large increase also in recent decades of working class American support for letting gays and lesbians adopt. Support rose from less than 40% between 1990 and 2007 to over 60% in 2008 through 2022. So there's movement in the right direction. In addition, 56% of the working class believes that there is too much discrimination against trans people. And 83% support protecting gay people from job discrimination. So, yeah, their views are not as progressive, our views, I should say, as those of middle or upper class folks, if you define working class in this case, which they do, as people without post-high school education. Not as progressive. Okay, but getting better. So why is this an issue that's been a problem? First of all, it's been exaggerated for a lot of reasons. It has been played up, obviously, by Republicans who see it as a winning issue. And there is a hardcore of the right, that 30 to 33% of the electorate that feels strongly about it, that gets fired up over that issue. And politically, it does make sense to fire up your base over certain issues. But I would also argue that the sort of billionaire donor class approach to LGBTQ and gender and other issues has been one that subliminally and not so subliminally communicates to working people that this is not part of helping them succeed. It's part of avoiding the economic issues that might be inconvenient for the wealthy class in this country. I'll give you an example of what I mean. First of all, take the phrase um, take the phrase glass ceiling that Hillary Clinton or any other woman, and I maybe used for other groups as well, to be the first one to reach the when it's talked about in corporations, the chief executive officer's seat or the C-suite or the boardroom, that you're breaking the glass ceiling. My answer to that is, why is there a ceiling, and why should most working people care about one woman getting to join the billionaire club while most women are still struggling to make ends meet? I'd be fascinated, since we're talking about polling, in seeing a poll that asks working mothers, would you rather see one woman become a billionaire CEO, or would you rather see a million working mothers have affordable child care? I think the answer would be illuminating. And I think on some level, people sense that presenting the issue in that way is a distraction. It's not really as pro gender rights as it sounds. And for example, we saw when I worked for Bernie Sanders, he was by no means perfect. I don't claim he was, but we saw these kind of issues used to undermine the candidate whose policies were clearly going to be better for working women. We saw a pretense that somehow Bernie was not as strong on Black identity issues as his primary opponent, Hillary Clinton, even though his policies would have been much better for Black Americans, on and on and on. So we see identity issues used as a dodge. And I think there's a part, I don't know if you watched the Democratic Party online convention, but it was pretty ghastly. And a lot of, first of all, a lot of Republicans, but a lot of playing to the sort of glamorous LGBTQ non-binary world rather than the world of working people. For example, trans sex workers are live lives of enormous danger and violence. You didn't hear anything about that. You saw, fashionistas and so on, but you didn't see working people up there. People get it. People read it on a subliminal level. And what if they don't agree with us? What do we do then? What do we do, for example, about somebody who says, I don't think a trans girl, that is to say, someone who is assigned male at birth, but now identifies as female, should be allowed to use the girls' bathroom in a high school. Do we assume, as the Democratic commentators I mentioned earlier assume, that those people are just evil bigots, or do we talk to them, worker to worker, about why they feel that way? Because I can tell you that to a lot of working people I've spoken with, that feels reasonable. It feels scary and strange. And what we do with people who find something scary and strange is we don't judge them for not coming up in the same, or not being acclimatized to the same cultural milieu that we may live in. We reach people where they are. If you don't want to reach people who disagree with you, then politics isn't your game. And Donna Brazil and the rest of them should get another job, which they should, because you have to talk to people about, this is how we're going to help you, and don't worry about the trans girl on the soccer team. Teachers are good people. You know that. In fact, red state working people turned out in force to support the teacher strikes of 2017 in West Virginia and Oklahoma and Arizona. So you could say to them, look, we know our teachers are good people. If there's a situation that's unfair to one child or another, what matters is that we all live in a country where we can be financially secure, have decent lives, and have the households we want to form with the people we want to love. That's something we can sell to everyone. Maybe not on the first conversation. Another issue we should discuss before we leave this all together is religion. I know that religion is a sensitive point for those of us on the economic left sometimes. And I think some of us misunderstand, for example, Karl Marx and what Marx had to say about religion. And in 1843, Marx wrote about religion that it is, quote, the fantastic realization of the human essence. Since the human essence has not acquired any true reality, the struggle against religion is therefore indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion, end quote. In other words, he's not saying it's bad to have religion or believe in God. It's bad when belief in God is used to distract you from the reality of the world you live in. He went on to say religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Now, we support the expression of real suffering and we protest the expression of real suffering. So we can identify with any of our religious compatriots in that sense. He then went on to say religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Now, why did he want to abolish it? Well, he wanted to abolish organized religion because he said that that abolition would, he meant, and I will quote again, the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people. That is, he said, the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. So if we can see the world as it is, and again, this is 19th century writing, religion can have a place in that world, of course, as long as it's not being used to distract and subrogate him. As Marx wrote, the critique of religion is in embryo the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Say what you will about the man, but he could write. He said, criticism, meaning of religion, has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order, meaning the chain of, binding us in slavery, not in order that man should continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation, because that would be horrible, but so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. So that's what we were talking about with religion. We don't have to tell anybody their religion is naive or foolish or any of those things. We can say that there are a lot of preachers and rabbis and others out there using that religion to manipulate you and to keep you in subjugation. But just as there was liberation theology in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, religion doesn't have to be a tool of illusion. It can be a tool of liberation. So we should not allow that to separate us from our fellows, our fellow working people. And I guess I'll close with this. I think most of us probably here today would identify as socialists or democratic socialists or something along those lines. And there's long been the feeling that that's a non-starter in American politics to call yourself that. Obviously, that's changing a lot. First with Bernie Sanders, now with Zohran Mamdani and others. But either way, I wouldn't let that be an obstacle to talking to fellow working people. Sometimes I say, I'm a socialist, as in Social Security. I'd like to see more programs like Social Security and Medicare. I'd like to see both those programs expanded and made better. I think that society should have control over the things that belong to all of us, like the air and the water and our other precious resources. You want to call me a socialist, call me a socialist. But if to you that means some scary, murderous creature, well, no, that's the other guy. So in that case, I'm not your guy. And so I will say, you can just, I prefer to talk in terms of specifics. For example, I was on a Fox News show and the host said to me, the talking point at the time, Social Security's trust fund, that's just a bunch of IOUs. That was George W. Bush's talking point. And I said, don't you pay your IOUs? And he laughed. He said, I'm going to think about that. So, yeah, I mean, we just pay our IOUs to each other. If you want to call me a socialist for that, I'm a socialist. But that should not stop us, nor should polling stop us, nor should fear stop us, whether it's in how we describe ourselves, whether it's in the policies we advocate. Some of them are already popular. Some of them we need to persuade the people on. But that's how we do it, one friend at a time, one fellow worker at a time. When they ask, if they ask, or if it comes up, or if we're knocking on doors, however, we just say our piece, talking to other fellow workers. And I'll close with this, I guess. A lot of people who are in the so-called professional managerial class of whether it's lawyers or whether a higher paid subset, but by and large, or minor executives, managers, what have you, feel that they're not workers. But my view is this: if you don't control your income, if someone else gets to say whether you get paid or not and how much you get paid, you're a worker. And if you're not an owner of a co-owner, or don't have some sort of participatory democracy in how your workplace is run, you're a worker. So whoever you're talking to, you're not talking to somebody from a different subset of people from another land called worker land. You're talking to a fellow worker. And I think I hope we can all enter into a conversation in that spirit as your fellow worker. I'll conclude by saying, of course, I welcome your comments, criticisms, and suggestions. As always, thanks for listening.